a platform that its misuse, its mismanipulation, and its miscontrol can inevitably collapse multiple democracies, multiple systems, and inevitably cripple them extensively. We think that there needs to be a system, there needs to be a structure in place that allows for there to be accountability within these systems, and at the same time allow for victims of these systems and victims for your lack of responsibility to seek redress. So, panel, what does our policy look like, and what does this framework look like? So, understand that in the status quo, which is what we're against, you cannot sue companies like Twitter, to companies like Facebook for whatever misinformation, whatever slander, and whatever impacts those things have upon your life. We think that what we would see is a structural change within that system that allows you to hold these people accountable, that allows you to sue these big corporations and inevitably hold them accountable for the dangerous impacts and the dangerous harms that those kind of policies and those kind of decisions could possibly have on your life. So that's what our framework looks like. So why is it particularly imperative? First and foremost, on principle justification. So the thing about having access to things of extreme power is simply this, is that to the extent where that misuse can cripple and collapse systems, for example, what Cambridge Analytica did to like tons of elections around the world, then there needs to be some metric and some control to allow that to a very large extent, those kind of misuses, those kind of mismanipulations, and all those other problems are largely limited. I'm going to show you one how our world does this, but further deeper into principle of justification. Understand this, that the reason why these companies are in the first place able to thrive is primarily because of government. Government is the guarantor that allows money work as a functional currency. Government has inevitably given tons of bailouts and tons of support to a lot of tech industries and a lot of tech companies over time. Governments even act in ways that protect tech companies and give them freedoms in multiple ways, right? We think that to that extent, there exists a large burden or a large degree of responsibility on the grounds of reciprocity for them to engage and implement policies in such a way or act in such a way that allows that government to be maintained and allows that government to be sustainable. To the extent where they are not doing this, to the extent where they are not engaging in this action, we think that inevitably that action itself is fundamentally criminal, right? But in the instance why we think that it should be the people that hold these people liable, is that in a lot of instances, the impacts of this slander might not necessarily be government driven. Why? Because they are broad, they are large, and are hard for governments to inevitably sue. But the thing about people is that people that are impacted by these things hold these things particularly relevant, particularly important, and as such can champion these cases and inevitably carry these cases by themselves and engage these issues in a way that provides a certain degree of solvency for them, right? But the next thing that you need to get on context is that corporations in the status quo are definitely not doing enough to create betterment of society, right? Corporations sell people's data and manipulate that to get a lot of results. Corporations in the same instances do not go far enough to ensure that misinformation doesn't happen, right? There is very, very limited control of misinformation in most spaces. Examples of this is Facebook, Reddit, and a whole lot of social media spaces. The company that comes the closest to giving those kind of systems by showing some degree of watching out, oh guys, this is possibly not true, this is possibly false, is possibly Twitter, right? But even then, there's still a large degree of misinformation because corporations as a whole are not doing enough. To the extent where corporations know that they can be held liable, to the extent where corporations know that their benefits, their profits, their wealth, and inevitably the core reasons why they create these companies in the first place are then put under risk because they can get sued, they can lose cases, and inevitably in a lot of instances gain a lot of bad rep and a whole lot of problematic expenditures because of that. In that instance, corporations now have a very strong incentive to ensure that misinformation doesn't happen, to always ensure that the information that is given is largely cost reference, and in most instances doesn't happen, right? But a good context as to why we think that today's debate will probably not be about small like false stories, but largely about the more impactful stories is simple, right? Is that at the end of the day, the people are suing for damages, right? So inevitably people would sue based on the premise that their damages are significant, right? So at the end of the day, big things like stripping off elections, when proven to be culpable or inevitably part of the narrative or part of the idea that promoted those particular things, can be largely done to sue for very large damages. Why is this beyond this morally consistent, right? And this is lagging on to like our principal justification. Is that in the status quo, when newspapers promote or inevitably sell false news, sell false information, and sell false data, they are still held accountable. They are sued to court and they are inevitably held like responsible for these things. We do understand that in a lot of instances, Twitter doesn't have like direct control over the people that are producing or limiting this information. But to the extent where it provides the platform for the propagation of this particular news and its spread, then it's particularly imperative that they are held culpable for these issues. CEO your POI. Shield.
If the justification for the rights which social media companies owe is this idea of enablement, does Twitter owe obligations, for instance, to authoritarian governments which own telco networks on which they operate?
Okay, for context, this is what we're saying, right? Is that when you inevitably misinform people, right, there are extensive harms done by virtue of misinformation. In a lot of instances, you provide the spaces that allow for that misinformation to happen. But in the same vein, you do nothing to ensure that information that is given has some modicum of truth, some degree of truth, and in a lot of instances maintains the consistency of its message. To the extent where you as a person, you as an active party, are now significantly harmed by their ignorance, their refusal to take take responsibility most times for the sake of more profits, for the sake of more users, and for the sake of acquiring more data, inevitably prioritizing their capitalistic intent in these instances. We think that it is only relevant, it is only just, it is only fair for you to hold these companies accountable for creating an enabling environment that allows for misinformation, the exploitation of truth, and inevitably like the significant impacts that are done. So, panel, what have I extensively proven? I have proven one, that there is an intrinsic principle justification that reminds and compels these people to be responsible for creating large spaces like that, that can easily destroy democracies, that can easily weaken structural systems, and can easily lead to a lot of social injustice in the status quo. To the extent where you have that degree of power, you should be held accountable for the impacts that are done when you're not responsible with that power. In the same instance, we show you how that responsibility increases by attacking the profit incentive that these corporations have. But finally, we show you holistically how our side gets like clear-cut benefits by allowing redresses for the victims of these harms. We are very, very proud to propose from side OG. Thank you.
The Prime Minister for the verifying speech. Invite the leader of opposition. Open the case for opposition. Here.
All right, thank you. I will be watching the chat for points of information, and I will accept at least one during my speech. With that out of the way, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. So let me start with a couple of points of rebuttal, and then I'm going to move into the meat of my case, which is about the chilling effect that this kind of motion would have on the hosting of free speech, right? So first of all, we need government to contend with in what ways social media platforms will be held liable for content posted on their site. What kind of things would they be sued for, right? And whose standard of illegal are we going with? Specifically, we want to know whether they are okay with governments suing them for whatever governments think is illegal, right? Okay, first of all, my contentions, right? They say that corporations in the status quo aren't doing enough for society. We want to characterize these platforms, specifically platforms like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, right, as being profit-driven, right? And specifically, it is not in their interest to ensure the betterment of society. We think this is going to play a key role in our case, right? We think that a lot of people, however, do take their news from social media, right? And what this means is that these services are very cautious and conservative to anything that could stimulate their platform, right? We also need the government to contend with what the idea of illegal means, right? Because the law extends across borders, right? We've seen the extent of the GDPR on all of the internet. We've seen the effect of a burgeoning Chinese market on Hollywood films, for example, right? And we think that the definition of illegal needs to be considered not only in the best case of Western liberal democracies, but also in conservative and regressive societies. For example, authoritarian regimes like China, the banning of political speech in certain countries. Even if we do set this motion in a Western liberal democracy, we have to understand that by pressing the law against social media firms domestically, right, we allow and we set the precedent that other firms overseas can do it as well, right? How does the law cross borders, right? It is far more efficient and efficacious for these platforms to stay on the right side of all laws, right? Not to, be stuck in a legal morass of what is legal here, not legal there, right? And to err on the side of caution, right? Again, this is due to their profit motive, right? They want to be most efficient about just taking down whatever is illegal anywhere. In particular, we would like to raise the example of the Singapore POFMA, or Protection Against Online Falsehoods and Misunderstandings Act, right, which is used to take down and sue opposition material, which is critical of the government, right? And it's going to tie directly into my content on a chilling effect on free speech. So the statistic that was most relevant to me is that YouTube receives 60 hours of video every minute, right? It is an absolute ocean, a waterfall of content, right, that no human can process. And so no human does process it, right? They process it with a very cautious and conservative algorithm, right? In particular, this system, probably a neural network, right, is not understood by anyone, including its creators, right? That's just the nature of neural networks, right? And how that matters, right, is because platforms may also choose to steer viewers away from sensitive content that might be illegal, right? Why would they choose to do this? Because they're incentivized to do so, right? The press uses these kinds of things as a cudgel. For example, UK newspapers have been smacking YouTube with stories about how BMW was advertised against beheading videos that happen to be on their platform, right? Even though this video only received thousands of views, which I think most of us know is nothing, right? That number does mean something to the public, right? Why does this matter, right? We think that when this happens, when platform creators adopt cautious and conservative algorithms to take down anything that might be illegal, even if it isn't, anything that is on the gray area of the law. And we want to point out that the law is gray, right? It is not always well defined, right? And also when they design and they steer their algorithms to push people away from contents that might be controversial and potentially illegal, even if they're not actually illegal, right? This is a chilling effect on free speech, right? It means that content creators and uploaders need to stay on the right side of an unknown, ill-defined system, right? And because they do not want to be kicked off the platform or disfavored by it, right, and have audience steered away because this is often their livelihood, right, they will stay away from controversial topics. I'm going to next move on to why this is so incredibly harmful, but before that, closing government appointed information.
If you seriously want to target repressive governments, how would you stop the misinformation purveyed by governments like Russia's, Iran's, and Myanmar's?
We don't see how that changes on both sides of the house. We understand that happens, and we think that it's harmful, but we would need the government to explain to us how motion adoption would prevent such a thing. Okay, so let me next move on to why the chilling effect on free speech is so incredibly harmful, right? Social media, as we have seen, is where a lot of discourse happens, right? It's important that we encourage and we allow discussion of controversial issues there, right? Often issues that are going to step on the government's toes. Should we not have discussion in Singapore about government graft because it is supposedly illegal or might be illegal, right? Chilling of free speech, broadly, we think, always favors the powerful. And that is why this is so incredibly harmful, right? It inevitably allows corruption and abuse of power to be censored and to go by unaddressed, right? Take, for example, discussion of Hong Kong and the oppression of the Uyghur Muslim minority in China, right? It's important, not only for China, for Chinese citizens, but also to discuss this. Of course, now, opposition is going to say, well, if we said this in Western liberal democracy, this doesn't really count, right? But it's important for citizens involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, with whom China is investing a lot of money, to have frank and open discussions about these kinds of human rights abuses, right? And their governments, right? Governments in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, where the Belt and Road Initiative is being rolled out, may not be interested in them having discussions about these abuses in China, right? And we think in that kind of world where there is less incentive, right, that there will be this chilling effect on free speech. So we see that, again, as the law crosses borders, right, it suppresses discussion of incredibly important issues, right? We bite that people are going to do bad things with social media, right? And we think the government is going to tell you all of the ways that people use social media to do bad things. But we think that these individuals should be prosecuted for the bad things that they're doing, right? We understand that social media can be used for a lot of harm, but we think that the platforms themselves are not responsible for those harms, right? And in all of those cases, where someone does something bad with social media, you can sue the person and not the platform, right? They need to prove why platforms are uniquely harmful for doing this. And if we hold the platform not just accountable, but legally responsible, right? We think this will have a chilling effect on free speech because, as we note, platforms have explicit incentive not to have horrific or terrible or illegal content on their platform already, right? Which is that they have a lot of viewers who would, boycott or leave the platform if they saw something horrific on it, right? So we think that their incentives are already reasonably well aligned to keep bad things off the platform, but we do not want to censor free speech. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
The leader of the opposition for the verifying state, invite the Deputy Prime Minister to view the case for government. Yeah.
Sorry, give me a second. Okay, so for point of information, just unmute yourself and then ask. I won't be looking at the chat. Just to confirm if I'm audible.
All good.
Okay, I'll set my timer and I'll be starting soon. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, recognize how opening opposition already loses out in this debate. So the major question that they ask us to defend is why platforms should have the blame, right? Instead of having individuals themselves. So I'm going to give you a couple of responses to that. The first idea is oh, look, you can't necessarily tell people to stay quiet on social media, right? Because people are not necessarily gonna get scared to be sued. But even if they do, we still think those platforms can give people anonymous roles. So someone can just post as an anonymous human, right? Or they can just post as a board. So we don't necessarily think at that point you can be able to sue those individuals if you don't know who posted that particular idea. On the idea of platforms, right? You think when actually we put a blame on platforms, we have a high amount of effectiveness. This already exists in mainstream media where we sue the platform in and of itself when false information is detected at that point. So we don't necessarily think the claim from open opposition stands in this debate. But secondly, what we tell you from OG is the system currently is bad and it needs to change. So what we say is we need a world that allows people to get accountable, when the act, to get accountable, when they act in certain ways, right? So we think at that point, these companies are usually liable for that. Secondly, what OO says is it was an idea to say whether we are okay with the government suing these platforms. Panel, recognize in this debate we are happy with whosoever sues these social media platforms, the individual that is usually affected. For example, if let's say the leaders of the BLM are usually affected by false information that actually accrues within Twitter or within Facebook, we think they've got that moral incentive for them to sue Twitter or Facebook at that point, right? So we think those individuals, because they are usually harmed because of the content that is posted on those social media, they have that moral imperative. But secondly, the claim is, oh, look, these platforms are usually profit driven. That is to say, they don't have any responsibility to the individuals. Recognize, panel, when you actually create a content a platform that allows individuals to come together and interact, you already assume responsibility to the society, even if you maximize profit. We already see this when you look at things like the industries that are usually profit driven, right? But they still have that sense of environmental liability. This is the same when it comes to social media, right? Because at a point at which you say you have a social interaction, you create that responsibility towards the society. What this means is when individuals want to access information within that media, what you do is you have to actually approve accurate information at that point. Recognize a lot of individuals access their information through the media, through media, right? Social media. For an example to this is how we have seen with the Russian elections, where these individuals usually access the political power or the political bargain through social media. At a point at which there is huge access of false information at that point, we think the individuals, the vast majority of people within the Russian sphere are usually going to access that false information. Recognize how this is bad in a long term. We think panel they lose on that factor, but also what we get from OO is oh look, content creators are actually going to lose their free speech. Panel, from OG, we say we don't care about free speech if that free speech is harmful. Recognize, in our world, we say when we actually push for censorship, what we do is, when we push for censorship, maximum censorship from these companies, what we do is we have free speech that is true speech. Because what OO tries to claim is free speech should be anything, whether it's harmful or it's hateful. In our world, we say recognize the social contract that exists between individuals and the government. You lose out on certain rights if those rights are usually harmful. The main reason why panel someone has got a freedom, has got that right to do whatever they want, like they can kill anyone if they want to. But the reason why we imprison them is because of the harmful factors that exist to those individuals. This is the same in principle. If you post something that is hugely defamating to one individual, we think that at that point you lose that free speech. But in this instance, when it comes to media, we think the individual that should be responsible is the people that run the platform, because those individuals can post through anonymous, like through like an anonymous post where we can't necessarily sue those individuals or can't necessarily punish those individuals. Recognize how that information may usually spread out, and it creates like the harmful factor to like the particular individual that is being sued, and it harms them in the long term. So we think we actually achieve change at that point when we have them. Panel, why is this fundamentally justified for us to do this? Recognize when you have access to the extreme power, like you have an obligation to show like a sense of responsibility. This responsibility looks like increasing your censorship policies or the policy that evaluates the type of information that is usually posted on social media platforms. An analogy to this panel, recognize when you are selling guns and then you sell a gun to someone who doesn't have a license, we will hold you accountable because we think the maximum censorship that exists in your world was not hugely enough. On a principle level, this is the same. We are having like someone who runs the social media platform, then allows someone posting false information. At a point at which they post that false information, what they do is they actually like don't maximize censorship. What this does is it harms like those individuals in a long term. So recognize the importance of this principle to say on a principle level, we think it is justified to usually maximize these policies that hold these companies liable. What are we going to achieve at the end of the day in terms of impact? Firstly, on the idea of accountability, we think because these people know that like there's a sense of accountability that exists within them, what they're more likely to do is they're more likely to increase their policies that evaluate the type of content that is posted on Facebook or that is posted on Twitter. The impact of this is we are going to usually attain information that is accurate, information that is usually truthful. People are going to access that information without like being skeptical about the information that they access on social media. In conclusion, what OG has proven to you in this debate is like on three levels: the idea of the principle, the idea of like the incentive that exists within like these companies, and lastly the idea of accountability. Panel, we propose.
Deputy Prime Minister for the very fine speech. Invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for opposition.
All right, am I audible for everyone? All right, give me a sec to set up my timer. And while I do so, just real quick, I'm not going to be looking at the chat. So if you guys have a POI, I'd love for you to just briefly unmute yourself, and I'll try and address you. If not, then I'll try and stop around like 5:30, 5:45, just to make sure that we have some POIs, because I do want to engage. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Panel, the structure of my speech today is going to basically follow, first of all, touching on the failures of SideGov in today's debate that I hope are like addressed in the back half of today's debate, that ultimately I think take the teeth out of the government argument that we disagree with in the first place. And then I'm going to move on to a unique extension of my own and really characterizing this debate for us, right? Because this debate doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are other factors involved. There are other sources of the same exact content that exist that are not redressed. They haven't proven to us why uniquely social media being like held more accountable than they already are in some vague way that they haven't proven to us is going to have some sort of unique ability on eliminating all of these illegal kinds of content, right? So let's get into exactly what I think is a failure on SideGov, right? First of all, we see a failure of them to expand the debate. Let's be very clear on why limiting today's debate to Western liberal democracies is wrong. And that's because there's no such thing as an objective evaluation of why the Western liberal democracy's legal system is correct in every case, or why the government is correct in every case, especially when we see the United States government spying on its own people and content with the Patriot Act, and the unique influence of lobbying in these countries to make laws that might specifically target like the enemies of these lobbyists so that they would directly influence social media and be held less accountable in the status quo. When my partner brings this up to you, it's thoroughly unrefuted by SideGov because they refuse to recognize the idea that A, Western liberal democracies' laws might be wrong, and B, we are not talking only about Western liberal democracies. So I'm going to get into this a little bit later when I get into my extra characterization of why like an evaluation of what is harmful to who is so important to address in today's debate. But further, like when Jon Stewart did a bit on the Daily Show about the British Parliament specifically centered that segment in the UK, right? This kind of self-interested behavior of governments is what we want to avoid. But second, we think that government fails when government fails to achieve any impacts that they talk about, because I think we see a clear failure on the side of OG to show us why the gov world will be different from the status quo. They themselves recognize that in the status quo, social media sites can be sued by victims of this illegal content. They fail to outline what extra ways, what extra specific methodology they'd be using to hold these social media sites accountable. And let's understand that there's really no shortage of methods, right? Social media platforms with a pattern of being sued for illegal content could be sanctioned, for instance, or there could be a fine on top of any legal fees that they might have sustained, right? There is a wide avenue of actual methods that could be used to enforce these rules that Gov is talking about, instead of just talking about the principal debate of why these social media platforms should be the ones to hold should be the ones holding these things accountable in the first place, right? But let me get into exactly why I don't think that, first of all, this is the responsibility of social media sites, and second of all, how my partner specifically addresses the idea that you're not going to be able to see any sort of objective or any sort of like good or net good correction of social media sites, right? Because when the DPM comes up here and talks about the fact that we don't care about free speech if that free speech is harmful, we need to talk about who is that actually harmful to? What if the government declares harm? What about examples such as the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, where they show the images of the Prophet Muhammad, right? In one country, that is perfectly legal. In another country, that is very illegal, right? I think that you really need to contend with the idea that free speech will inevitably offend, but it must stand. You really need to contend with the idea that there is a different evaluation of what is legal and what content is acceptable in different countries. And ultimately, confining it to just a Western liberal democracy's point of view is like saying to these countries where the Prophet Muhammad's image is strictly illegal, that their view of why this is illegal is completely wrong, backwards, and doesn't make any sense. Right? I think that's a unique harm. I think that's really disrespectful. But further, the responsibility for having correct information isn't what falls on social media. It's what falls on news media. The responsibility to strive towards objectiveness is a responsibility of news media. And yet we still see, I'll take the POI.
Sorry. Don't you think that this topic is talking about objective things like fake news and defamation and not just about free speech that is more contentious? Shouldn't we be focusing on those examples instead?
Okay, defamation, first of all, can be sued for in the status quo. That's not a change that we see. But second of all, the way that you just use objective to refer to fake news is really like problematic, because the idea that like fake news in one country where it is simply defined as something that like criticizes the government versus like another country where fake news is defined as something that specifically misleads the public about something that has objective truth to it, I think that that's very different, right? There's no such thing as objectiveness in this. What we need government to do is tell us like why there would be some sort of net benefit when all we see are these harms and all these conflating contradictory factors, right? But next, let me get into my key extension before I get into really summing up what we see from OG and why my partner's arguments ultimately went out. My key extension is the idea that we're ultimately going to see no fundamental change, right? OG has come up here and talked to us about how principally social media sites should be holding their their sites accountable. But they haven't really given us a mechanism for why this would actually be beneficial to anyone, right? In the first place, I don't think that social media sites have this incentive. I think that they are profit driven. I think that these companies are private. I think that it's necessary to touch on the fact that social media platforms are already susceptible to lawsuits anyways, and they're susceptible to like the views of the people who use their platform. But we're not going to see any change because of the existence of websites and news media that in the status quo will like have this content anyways, right? Social media is a place for opinions, and opinions are going to stand, right? Some opinions are going to be inflammatory. Some opinions are you're going to disagree with. Some opinions might be illegal in one country and not illegal in another, right? Ultimately, they're already what we see is like no difference whenever you take out like an illegal content on one piece of social media that like increases whether or not people think that this is like that increases debate over whether or not this is illegal or not. And further, this illegal content is still going to exist on a website that exists just like in the dark web, and it creates like more negative and harmful communities. So what have we ultimately talked to you about today? Ultimately, we've talked to you about the fact that OG mischaracterizes social media entirely. We don't think that they have any teeth in their arguments. We don't think that they provide a specific mechanism to achieve at any like harms that they think exist in the status quo in the first place. And how to like redress them. My partner instead tells you that we need to bring some nuance into this debate. There's going to be this chilling effect on free speech that is something that you can't objectively decide, right? And we need government to tell us how suddenly they're going to introduce objectiveness in a field that has never seen it before.
And the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for the very fine speech. Invite the Member of Government to open the second half of this debate.
Hi, am I audible? Okay. Panel, one thing we have to make very clear in today's debate, we're not talking about free speech as a whole. We're talking about suing social media companies for illegal content. And what we mean by that is objective facts, fake news, defamation. First of all, they said that in their answer to my POI, that defamation is already sued. I guess, yeah, sure, it can already be sued, but it's about suing the individual, not the social media platform. They also said about how social media platforms are already liable, which doesn't really make sense, as that's the whole point of today's motion, is that whether we should introduce them. And then they also said about fake news, about how it's not objective, right? We see that that's not the case. Fake news, there's a very clear line between subjective and objective facts. Fake news, we're just talking about things like, for example, reporting fake figures. For example, in Donald Trump's case, about like all the fact checkings, right? Those are the things that we're targeting. We're not targeting opinions. And we think that's a very clear distinction that we have to make on government. And those are the things that we're focusing on, not opinions, right? Okay, so first of all, before I go into my extensions and provide a little bit more of the mechanisms that we think that opening didn't really provide, let me just provide a few rebuttals, right? First of all, on the context, they basically separate it into two major fields. One in, for example, places like China, non-liberal democracies, and the second one on liberal democracies. First of all, we say that this debate should focus on the latter, because in the first place, the government already has such a huge control over social media platforms. These news, these opinions are not even on there in the first place. Let's look at examples that they've given, right? For example, China, which essentially has a firewall that closely monitors it within a gated community, doesn't allow any information to go in, as well as already has a high level of surveillance, right? That's why we think that actually today's debate focus should be on liberal democracies, where there's more contention, where even if we do agree that, yeah, sure, the state may still have its own vested interest, but that's not what we're primarily looking at. We're saying that it has a clearer legal structure, a clearer sort of legal standing that is under public scrutiny and at least stands up to the rule of law, right? Also, bear in mind that we agree with the model that our opening gave, right? That this is a civil law case. We're not saying that the state is going to use this to their advantage. It's rather people and stakeholders are going to be the primary people at the front trying to push these claims targeting social media. Later on in my substantives and extensions, I'll explain why this is actually beneficial and why it creates a deterrence effect, something that closing asks us to give. Okay, second major rebuttal essentially was about how it was quite of a wishy-washy point from their second speaker in closing about how people would be pushed to go to the dark web. We think that's pretty much just quite a lazy argument just in general, right? It's just quite a cliched example of, oh, there's going to be the black market, there's going to be unregulated things. We think that it's in our government fiat that we can actually claim that these places, these social media platforms can also be sued as well. And that's why we don't think that that's really part of today's debate. Okay, let me just go straight into our substantives, right? Why do we give you the mechanisms as to why we think that there actually is an incentive, and how do we produce a tangible change? We agree with with opposition's characterization. Social media platforms are not to change the public for the good; they are for profit. So let me explain to you why having this, having social media as liable is going to infringe upon it, right? First of all, obviously, as our opening did say, obviously there are going to be charges and fees if they lose the lawsuit. But we think other than that, it's also about afterwards, right? Where does the money from social media come from? It comes from their user base. And if they are now proved in public, in court, that they have been conducting illegal acts for posting illegal content, are they still going to be keeping that audience base? We think highly not. And that's why, because not only from losing the money in the court case itself, but also in the long-term tangible impact to the image of the company, to the image of the social media platform, we think that they have a very high incentive because of those financial reasons to actually impose more checks and balance, to make sure that they actually have a stronger sort of control over what is being posted, and to see and to take down any sort of fake news or fake information that they experience. Before I move on, yes, I'll take the POI from opening.
Okay, so this public accountability mechanism that you're proposing, why doesn't this already happen in our world, right? We already see Facebook and Twitter being shamed, particularly Facebook, for the influence on Russian operatives, right? Why do we need the law to step in, right, and governments to get involved in order for the public to be aware of what's going on?
We're not just saying that that's the only reason. We're saying that in a legal case, it gives it legitimacy. When it goes through, when it's in the controlled space, right, which is essentially what the court creates, it's a controlled space where both sides can debate and actually make sure that it's actually the facts. We see that that's much more powerful than just say right now public scrutiny. We think that that's an extra step that we can take to make sure that this sort of disinformation as well as these acts are no longer there. Okay. Also, another thing, right? We think that there's also an incentive, why this benefit, actually, they've talked a lot about oppressive states, right? We actually think that that's a point on our side. Let me explain why. Because right now, it's no longer the state who's going to be pushing the claim, right? It's going to be people. So let me just give you a very concrete example. Let's take the Myanmar example again. We say that when a citizen in America or whatnot sees this fake information, they sue the company because they want money, right? They want benefits. Ultimately, human beings want profit, or they want money. So then when they sue the company for something that's happening across the world, essentially still holds at least, and make sure that these things are not just completely uncontentious. We think that this actually creates more publicity for that event as well as more legitimacy. And that's why we think that it actually helps at least raise awareness for that significant issue. Another major reason about why, in terms of principle, that we think opening could have given more substantives about is about why social media should be held accountable. They gave us one major thing, right, is that they have power. We think that it's beyond that. It's because they directly benefit from these crimes that holds them accountable. It's not just because of their ability to provide the platform. It's also because what they gain from it, right? From all that increased sort of talk, from all that discussions or heated debates or whatnot, they're essentially getting more and more profit in terms of information, in terms of data, in terms of user time. And that's why we think that's a major reason as to why they should be held liable, not just because of their power alone. Okay, so essentially, by making sure that there is more attention and how it can expose government today, what we've essentially tried to show is that, yeah, sure, there could be a chilling effect on some of the marginal cases. But when we really look at today's debate, we're talking about those which are quite black and white, right? We think that those would be primarily the cases that are going to be adjudicated because those are the cases easiest to win. Those cases about factual inconsistencies, factual errors, right? Those are going to be the ones that we want to take out of the public discourse. And we agree with our opening in the sense that we don't, if that is free speech, we shouldn't really include it, right? Because of the tangible harms that it creates to society. Giving the analogy, the very cliched ones about how you can't scream that there's a fire in a crowded theater. The reason for that is because it harms other people. It creates a stampede. It can effectively causes other people to be put in a situation of harm. And we think that because of this, and because we are 100% firm on the stance that facts that are proven to be wrong, or facts that are not factual, must not appear in the public sphere, nor should they be propagated by social media platforms. Because of that, we're standing firm in making sure that those things, we're trying to have as many sort of mechanisms to make sure those things don't go into the public sphere as possible. Hence, we urge you to support this motion. Thank you.
Any member of government for the verifying speech, invite the member of opposition to continue the case for opposition.
Excellent. Ian, could you perhaps turn the fan off? I'll do that. All right. Am I audible? Brilliant. Okay. POIs, could I have them in the chat, please? That would be brilliant. Yeah, nothing else further, really. Oh, right. Look, by this point in the debate, it's not clear from either side of the House whether we're going to have lots of speech being suppressed, not much speech being suppressed. We get this motion's going to apply in the developed world, not in the developed world, in Western liberal democracies, not in Western liberal democracies, only to very clear violations of the law or preemptively to all violations of the law. Let's actually deal and give you some clarity in this debate about why we think this is going to suppress free speech, why we think it is simply unfair to these social media companies, why we think it is not going to work in actually achieving government's objectives, but finally, and uniquely in extension, why we think it undermines competition in the technology industry, and why we think that has massive, broad consumer harms, which we think far outweigh the small discursive benefits government could pretend to give us in this debate. Let's talk firstly about the idea of whether these platforms are responsible. Firstly, let's just be clear, and I don't think OO fully got us here. Like, they do not type this text. They have not written the content which is defamatory. They have not written the fake news. They have also, crucially, and distinguishing them from, for instance, TV channels or, for instance, publishers of books, they have not either pre-cleared the users, because users can join social media freely, and neither have they pre-cleared the actual content. That is to say, they have very, very little pre-facto responsibility for the actual content which is coming out on their content. Secondly, the second mechanism that they told us for why they owe this duty is because they benefit from it. But fundamentally, that ignores the incentives acting on them. This stuff undermines public confidence in Facebook and Twitter, and means that those people are likely to move their, if they can, they're likely to move their screen time away from Facebook and Twitter onto their competitors. That is bad. That is a harm to those companies who make their money by advertising. They're not benefiting on it. Finally, this idea that, like, anonymous accounts mean we can't do individual responsibility, therefore we have to do collective responsibility. Firstly, like, that's a very small proportion of this debate, so we don't think it's the massive principle that they wanted to say it was. But secondly, just because you don't know who did a hit and run accident doesn't mean that you should, like, hold General Motors and Ford responsible for it, because presumably it was their car that did it. General Motors and Ford didn't hit that person. They are not responsible for it. Finally, we say that even in the case of anonymous accounts, there are lots of things like IP addresses and other stuff, I don't know, that you can trace people back to them, even if they attempt to be anonymous. That's how we get people who distribute child pornography. Okay then, right, now let's talk about free speech, the effect on free speech. Note that the only defense that's the closing opposition government gives you to the idea that this will chill free speech is, oh, this is going to be objective. Even if we concede that that is true, although of course we don't, we think that all of Opening's argumentation about why free speech is never objective is true. But even if we concede it's true, it is only true in the small proportion of cases which go to court, where the actual judge gets to make the decision, where the high-powered lawyer gets to make the decision. The debate is not about those cases. The debate is about the preemptive actions which Facebook and Twitter will take. Those preemptive actions are not made by the sort of Harvard law educated general counsel of Facebook, who might be able to make an objective judgment about the law. They're made by very low paid workers who barely understand the law that they are applying and have too little time in the day. They're just going to cancel speech because they have no benefit to allowing it, but they will get fired if Facebook actually gets sued for that content. Or they're made by computer algorithms, which again are likely to be massively risk averse, because as we tell you, these companies owe fiduciary duties to their shareholders to reduce their liabilities. That is to say, they will not want to be sued. All right, so we think there's going to be lots of actual legitimate speech being suppressed. Finally, on this idea of reducing misinformation. Firstly, let's defend the material and extend the material from OO about pushing people underground. Firstly, these alternatives do exist. That's why people move to things like Parler, when Twitter started getting all thingy. But secondly, they can't fiat that they will be able to sue these companies. Half of them are based in Russia, like child pornography and all these other things still exist on the dark web. You can literally order an assassination. You cannot suppress this black market. Why is it bad that people move to the black market? Because then you cannot exercise the individual accountability, because then you can't find their IP addresses. Then you can't find who the actual person is. You cannot do that in this if they actually go underground. Finally, we would say that this won't reduce the effect of misinformation, because people, if government gets their way, if government manages to convince them, people will trust everything they see on social media. They'll say government was so persuasive that everything they see on social media is going to be correct. Why is that a problem? Firstly, sometimes things are going to slip through the loops, which people are now going to believe. But secondly, lots of things aren't illegal, but are still really bad. And if people turn their filters down because they believe the social media companies are doing it for them, that information is going to be much more powerful. I'll take a POI before moving on to my extension. Opening.
Okay, simple question, right? The problem that you fail to understand is that corporations make their benefits and their profits from allowing people to have speech and free speech within those spaces. So to the extent where that speech is true, why would they still curb it in that instance, especially when it risks their profit?
No, because they don't. Fundamentally, these corporations, like, what are you gonna do if Facebook censors you for something which is like not that bad? You maybe move to an alternative, but there aren't that many alternatives. Secondly, like, Facebook doesn't really care if it gets rid of 5% of its user base, if that stops it from getting millions and millions and millions of dollars of fines, right? Like, just Facebook's going to do this calculus, and Facebook's going to say the things that the government can do to me are way, way worse. The things the government can do to me are much bigger than just a couple consumers leaving them. Finally, let's talk about social media competition. Note that any enforcement mechanism to stop the liability that government wants is going to be bloody expensive, right? Why is that? Because either you do it using AI, and if you want to use AI, you need a massive corpus of data to train that artificial intelligence on. Small upstart competitors do not have that massive corpus of data. Or you're going to use moderators, people from like those people in the Philippines and India that we talked about. That's really expensive. And crucially, Facebook did not have to do that when it was competing against MySpace. Those are costs being imposed on early stage companies, which the people they're competing against did not have to bear. What does that mean at the end of this debate? That's going to mean it's way, way harder to start a new social media firm, right? Because your VCs are not going to support you if you're going to get sued out of your mind the first time some tiny bit of defamatory content against a really rich person comes on your site. VCs aren't going to support that. They're going to demand you invest in these massive things, which are too expensive. Why is this important in this debate? Because the average individual person cares a lot more about the quality of social media they can access. They can access a significantly better quality of social media when there is competition in the social media market, when there is competition between social media companies. Proud to oppose.
Any member of opposition for the verifying speech, invite the government whip to close the debate for government. Here.
Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Cool, okay, thanks. I'm going to use their Ford analogy and say that social media companies have been asleep at the wheel. What they have been doing is the equivalent of letting people drive cars without checking their licenses. The fact that social media companies don't check who is using their platforms isn't absolving them from blame, it puts them at blame. It is their decision, their social media company, which has profited from not checking who uses their platforms. This is what their business is built from. This is what they have made their money from. They should not be absolved from responsibility of that. 2 points of clash in this speech and some direct rebuttal at the beginning to deal with what we just heard from closing opposition. Firstly, how do we best change the interests of social media? Secondly, what does this look like in terms of a broader landscape? What does social media look like at the end of this? On responsibility in rebuttal, first off, the first thing, as I said in my introduction, The exact things they outline are reasons why social media is responsible for this. Social media companies have deliberately structured themselves in a way so they cannot check who is giving information. They deliberately make it so information moves so quickly, can be copied, other people can post it before it can be taken down. They have directly profited and marketed themselves on those lines. They have benefited and profited off misinformation going on their platforms. Secondly, on this idea that it undermines confidence, we'd actually know that like Facebook has been able to successfully keep running ads lying about the election date because it's willing to take the hit and doesn't think it's going to get enough publicity. We tell you, and Christian told you in this extension, about why lawsuits are a unique mechanism to provide publicity, to provide new sources of information about the abuse that is currently going on in social media. What we'd fundamentally tell you is social media has been structured in a specific way that has allowed misinformation to grow, and as a result, they are responsible for that. Other rebuttal on preemptive action. The first thing I'd note about like preemptive self-censoring is they actually miss the point of what a lot of social media companies look like. In Myanmar, Facebook had 4 people checking all of the content in Burmese on Myanmar's Facebook page. Actually, the status quo is not enough people checking what is going on social media. We think that people working in those jobs would probably welcome more emphasis, more help, more people helping them as well. And we'd note there is a competitive advantage to not suppressing opinions. You probably want those things to remain on your platform. What you do want to suppress is information which clearly makes you liable to lawsuits. That is, reporting that Donald Trump has the opinion that he won the election versus reporting false news stories which say about voter fraud. On competition and early stage companies, we'd note that actually we think this gives new companies a unique advantage in that they are able to grow and evolve a new structure of social media in this new framework of the law, unlike Facebook, Twitter, which has to deal with their current way, which is information out as fast as possible. And actually they might struggle with these new laws. We think they actually give new competitors within social media a competitive edge and a help in the industry. We think it's likely to introduce new forms of competition. And note how this actually this contradicts their own argument about people flooding to alternative social media and other competitors as well. We think that is possibly likely, and we think that probably does happen and hurts their argument on competition. But before I go on, I'll take the POI from OO.
Given, on lawsuits is a solution, right? Given that billion-dollar social media firms can hire teams of the best lawyers, how does anyone who isn't equally rich or the government have even a chance of winning a lawsuit?
Great, getting onto this now. How do we change the interests of social media? So opening government tells you about the financial incentive change. What Christian gave you was the mechanization and the additional benefit of new information coming out about social media. What mechanisms did he give you? I think he gave you 3 mechanisms. Firstly, the fact that in the process of lawsuits, companies are forced to hand over information or are forced to say things in the courtroom. Secondly, that you create a financial incentive for big law companies or big individuals to try and sue companies in order to claim back their legal expenses. That is the difference between a Wired article exposing Facebook in Myanmar versus the idea of benefiting from like some ad revenue from that versus a lawsuit where you can claim back legal fees and get huge benefits from that. There is undercovered abuse taking place by social media companies. We allow that to be exposed. And thirdly, as we said, trials are high publicity. Even more people pay attention to it. This abuse comes out in a court of law. There is a sense of legitimacy there. There is a sense that social media really is rotting away the core of our society. So why is this so important? We think this impacts both a financial incentive and an awareness perception. We are giving people important information about social media. We think that is a good in and of itself. But we think increasing awareness does things that further damages social media companies, which makes them scared of violating those laws, which adds to the boycott Facebook campaigns and pushes them even further. We think we create an incentive for them not to have this social media to have negative information on their websites. So how does this change social media on the whole? We hear about the chilling effect on social media. Let's note off the bat, oppressive governments are already shutting down social media. China has taken down TikTok. Governments block people from accessing certain social medias. And we agree these companies are profit driven. Most of the time, they're willing to bow down to oppressive governments anyway. We've seen Google shutting off certain things based on the fact that they want the government to keep liking them. These things are already happening anyway. We don't think this is the most relevant context anyway. But firstly, this motion said about about clear violations of the laws, fake news, defamation. But secondly, they never proved why defamation why a chilling effect in and of itself is a reason not to do something. Defamation, hate speech, these are laws which are weighed off. The chilling effect is weighed off against the benefits that you bring. And they were never willing to engage in the benefits that we do bring. The clearly false information coming off social media, the information which causes certain ethnic groups to be attacked based on false information, the huge damage that does to democracy, and the fact that often oppressive governments use that fake media to influence their own population, to influence the elections of other populations. We were willing to weigh off the chilling effect against those clear benefits we get by changing the incentives of social media companies. Finally, on the black market, firstly, we can sue 4chan. Secondly, in the dark web, you massively reduce the number of people you can reach. And thirdly, you can't just assert that we can't do these things. We can do things like ban social medias if they refuse to give themselves up to lawsuits because they are not following the laws of our country. Even in that case, we think their side loses as a result of this. I'm very proud to propose.
Of government for the verifying speech. Invite the member of opposition to close the case for opposition and the debate as a whole.
Okay, cool. I'll take PureWise from the chat, please. That'd be great. Thanks. So it was extremely problematic for the closing government's case to base so much of their material and analysis on the harms that the harms that this will have are based on the attacks on groups that will happen, the attacks and effects this will have on democracy. Because the problem with this is because the question we asked them at that point then is, how do you enforce this in a civil liability case? Because we tell you that this necessarily needs to be a criminal case for a plaintiff to take on in a court of law if it's a group thing that they want to be talking about. If they want to be talking about, fundamentally their model, just like the rest of the case, just doesn't work. Okay then, so what am I going to do in my speech? So I'm going to tie up a couple loose ends that come up in the debate. I'm going to talk, then I'm going to talk a little bit more, and we're going to do some bit of impacting on the material and the extension that we brought out earlier, and then we're going to tell you why we beat the other teams in today's debate. Okay then, so I think the first thing to talk about then is this idea about the responsibility and whether or not this actually falls on the social media, or like let's say news media, the news media, for example. So specifically within the case of fake news, which government try to talk so much about. So the debate seems to be operating under the assumption that fake news is illegal, and also more importantly that fake news is it's so objective that we should obviously be able to tell what's fake news and what's not. The really problematic thing here then is, if it's the case that fake news is illegal, and if it's the case that it's extremely easy to tell when it violates the law or not, then just why the fuck aren't we just suing the why aren't we just suing the news companies themselves, right? Why do we have to go after the social media companies and they happen to have these things put on, right? We say that if you buy both of these premises, then this just isn't a thing that would happen. We say that far more responsibility lies on the news media. But further to this, we would just say we were giving you plenty of analysis on why it's the case that social media companies, there's a different level of responsibility they have over the things that they post on their platforms, which are necessarily different from those on other platforms. Okay then. So another thing they tried talking about is the dark web, and how they'll just somehow theater that we won't have to deal with the dark web. And we just say categorically that's untrue, right? We say that for those people that do want to access illegal things, we think that they're gonna still do that anyway, right? They can't be oh, but we're gonna make sure that they can't do it illegally. The whole point is that there are certain loopholes, right? The reason the dark web exists exists and it hosts illegal things like child pornography, like mercenaries, is because of the fact that is because it's unable to be taken down by the law. We say that they can't figure that out. We say that at the point where people still want to access that, they still have to do that anymore. But like we're giving you analysis on why at the point when you drive it underground, it's going to be far more harder to track because you can no longer access things like their IP addresses and whatnot that law enforcement can usually do if it's on social media. That's why it's far worse. Okay, and then like further on to that, they seem to be like, oh, but it's they seem to think it's contradictory because like you can't simultaneously have people who go to the dark web but also don't have competitors. And to that, we just say we're talking about two completely different groups here, right? So people who want to access the dark web are going to do that to get like illegal stuff. But we think for like newcomers, so the material they brought to you about competitors, we say like this is just a different group of people. These are people who have an idea for a new way to express yourself, for a new way to communicate, and we tell you that when you have such high burdens and costs placed on social media companies that they have to watch out and necessarily like self-censor themselves so they don't get on the wrong side of law. We say that these companies aren't able to like first of all just afford this, or they're unable to like raise the capital that they need to be able to do this, and it's going to be extremely pernicious. That I'll talk to you about. That I'll talk to you about later on. Okay then. So I think so. Okay. So the last thing. Okay. So quickly, I think the last thing to say then is that it's extreme. Is that like it's going to be difficult? We think this will undermine like the justice system, and that we say that like what's likely going to happen is that these social media companies are going to like hire law teams to like interpret the law because it's really expensive, and we don't think like other parties are going to be particularly interested in interpreting this law, and we say that they're able to like probably undermine this like this law in a way which favors them. Okay then. Okay, last thing. Okay, sorry. Actual last thing to say then, before I move on, is that we think like Gov's obsession with like wanting to get pre-clearance for everything that's posted just like an incredible barrier for people like to access this social media. So we said like recognize that there's like the social media actually has done a lot of good for the world, just in terms of like connecting people, just in terms of like people's ability to access information. And we think that like by placing such a high burden and like obstacle for people to do that when this is extremely problematic and just like takes away from a lot of good that they've achieved. Okay then, so talking about the impacts that like the high costs that are imposed on new competitors, meaning leading to a monopolization of the market by a single social media company. Okay then, so I think the first thing to say here is that when there are a couple dominant players on the market, we say it's just going to make the chilling effect that like our opening half tried talking about just so much worse, right? Because when there's only one thing and they control like what's to be said, we think it's going to be far worse. But secondly, we're also going to say that like at the point where like people associate what's on social media as like what's legal and like what's sort of like the accepted view of the state, like we've given you analysis on why this why people are going to lower their guard. They're more willing to like look at and be susceptible to content which isn't necessarily legal, but it's still like really, really bad and fucked up and dodgy. But like secondly, we also just say that it just extremely limits the like the spectrum of like what's acceptable speech, right? Because we say that in companies' pursuit of profit and the like natural risk aversion, we say they're naturally going to err on the side of caution, and as a result, we think it's going to lead to like more and more narrowing of like what's acceptable. I mean, this is incredibly harmful to democracy, incredibly harmful for discourse. But another thing to say here then is that like why we think this is going to be incredibly harmful if we have monopolization, as in we think this is going to cement the like lead and dominance of a certain few firms. And we say at that point where the company is where single firms are just completely dominating the space, we think they're going to be like have such a huge outsized impact and influence that they're going to like be able to hold. They're going to have incredible lobbying power. They're going to be able to hold like government ransom. So even if like government can fiat and that like they won't be able to repeal this, we think they'll still be able to lobby for other rules, which just like frees their hands up for social media so much more to be dodgy about an incredible amount of other things by cementing and like the monopoly that social media companies enjoy. You're just going to make the world a far worse place, both from the point of view of democracies, from the point of view of users, and from the point of view of the law. This is why we take this round.
The opposition with the very fine speech, and all the speakers for what was a very enjoyable debate. I think we will probably deliberate now in this room, which means I would encourage all of you to leave, make friends, etc. And is there a way to turn off the live on YouTube thing?
Thanks.
Judges, do you know if we should be deliberating in this room or elsewhere?
Usually yes, but it says live on YouTube.
Yeah, that was my worry. I'm gonna message the people and then we can just take a bit of time to think about our call and stuff.
Mhm.
The tab team is on it.
I just said nice.
Michael, can you please stop streaming this meeting onto YouTube?